Hello and welcome to Hessens County. I'm glad that you could join us again today for another TTRPG Talk. This series discusses tabletop role-playing games and related materials, world-building suggestions, and game design. Today's video is going to be a continuation of our look at the WOIN or WOIN Rules Reference document version 1.2. Last time, we looked at sort of the different legal options for using this engine in your own TTRPG-related works, as well as the sort of presentation and forms that it takes. Whichever approach you decide to use, today we will be examining the mechanics that are described in the WOIN Rules Reference Guide itself in order to determine if you actually do want to use this as the core of your game. Some of the mechanics are highly summarized or have key elements left out, as I mentioned in a previous video, so I will occasionally need to reference the Old, New, or Now core rulebooks that EM Publishing created, that originally created that this engine uses, in order to try to fully explain some of the missing pieces. WOIN uses a flexible dice pool mechanic with a variable target for action resolution. As we mentioned in our previous video, WOIN uses pools of 6-sided dice. The results of rolling the pool are then added together, unlike some other systems we've looked at in the past, and are then compared to a difficulty scale that ranges from 10 for a relatively routine action to 45 for ridiculously mythological achievements. However, your starting character is likely going to be trying to accomplish actions with a difficulty rating between, let's say, the 10 to 25 range. How do we build a pool? Well, the pools are generally determined by your character's attributes, skills, and the quality of the equipment that is being used in a particular check. So we will take a look at each of these in turn, starting with attributes. Each character in a WOIN-powered game has 8 core attributes. Strength, agility, and endurance mainly describe your character's physical characteristics. Intuition, logic, and willpower describe your character's mental characteristics, while charisma describes their personality and presence. Luck, our final core attribute, is not like the others. Instead, it is a renewable pool that you can draw on to bend the game in your direction when you feel that the story would be best served by it, like adding extra dice to a roll or triggering other special actions. The main secondary attribute that exists, which you can see here, is called reputation. This describes your character's notoriety, their contacts, and other advantages that they may gain by being a known figure in society, as you might imagine. Besides being useful to determine if you are recognized in a situation, it might also be of use to use reputation in replacement for charisma in many different types of social situations. Depending upon your setting, you may also want to add options for additional attributes for characters who might have supernatural abilities, some of which are described at the bottom of this page here. For example, EM Publishing's Fantasy Core Rulebook has magic in it, while the sci-fi-based new core rulebook introduced psionics, and the most recent Now book added chi in order to enable a martial arts-inspired action. I'm not going to go into the specifics of those special attributes, though. Normally, each of these, with the exception of reputation or whatever special attribute we just mentioned that your setting might need, start at 3 at the beginning of character creation and are then adjusted up or down depending on the character creation process. While it's not defined in the Rules Reference Guide, other WOIN products seem to suggest that a character should normally have around 44 points, distributed amongst their various attributes, plus any bonus points that you might have needed to add for your character's heritage. A typical being will likely have attribute scores running somewhere between 1 and 12, but beings pushing beyond the normal peak of humanoid performance may reach higher highs, and some NPCs you interact with, like monsters or large creatures, let's say, might have individual attribute scores that reach even higher than that. Your attribute scores determines the base of your dice pool. However, this is not on a 1-to-1 scale. Rather, instead, it uses a linear inflation scale, which you can see on the screen here. As you see, a character who is typically in that 1 to 12 range would have a base attribute dice pool running somewhere between 1 to 4 six-sided dice. Now, let's take a look at skills. There is no set list of skills in any materials in order to allow for flexibility. Each of the lists that you might see, like the one on the page here, is considered open-ended. You can literally add anything you want as long as it is relatively relevant. This, you can see here, is about as far as it goes in the actual manual, which, as you can see, it doesn't give you necessarily a whole lot of information outside of this list of skills, and it doesn't really tell you how ranks work, how you should be adding things, and stuff like that. So I'm going to be referencing the old core rulebook for the rest of this section. Each skill, at least in that rulebook, has a rank that runs between 1 and 15. Like attributes, these skills give you dice towards your roll using a linear inflation scale built around 5 different tiers that run from proficient, skilled, expert, mastery, and authority. Those 5 ranks seem to correspond with the first 5 tiers that you can see on our attribute or skill chart right there. Again, running from 1 to 15, so you get between 1 and 5 six-sided dice, potentially added depending upon your character's level in this skill. However, your usual character will likely only be adding between 1 and 3 dice unless they've become highly specialized in a particular area because, again, there are limits to the number of skill points that you're likely starting with. So unless you put everything all in one thing, your character's got to be pretty advanced to have 4 or 5 levels of skill dice. Our final element that will be added to the dice pool is equipment. Base level equipment does not add any dice to your pool. However, if your character does have above average equipment, you could potentially end up adding anywhere between 1 to 5 extra dice in your pool, reflecting how high quality it is. For example, you might expect that a well-made sword might potentially add 1 die to your pool, while a character wielding, Excalibur would more likely be adding like 5d6 to their pool. However, there is actually an additional rule that has been added where a character cannot add more equipment dice to their dice pool than the relevant skill dice that they are adding to this roll. This is to reflect the idea that high-quality equipment works best in the hands of a master of their craft, and that the equipment does not make the master. Going back to our example of a knight wielding Excalibur, if they're only skilled at using swords, being the middle tier of skill ranks, then they can add 3 skill dice to the pool. They would also only be allowed to add a maximum of 3 equipment dice to the roll, thanks to their skills not being equal to the legendary blade involved. One more thing to add about equipment. I previously mentioned that you can add anywhere between 1 to 5 dice to a pool for having high-quality equipment. But what happens when you have low-quality equipment, or none at all? Well, if you have poor quality equipment, or you're having to improvise, essentially, instead of adding dice to your pool, you would instead typically deduct 2 six-sided dice from your pool. So, for example, if you are a high master at doing a particular trade or skill, but you don't have your usual stuff, and you're just having to kind of make it up as you go, like let's say you're an artist and you're trying to create a painting, but you don't have paint, and you have to kind of make your own, then obviously you're not going to make as high quality an item. So you're going to be deducting 2d6 from your pool. The last thing that would affect the number of dice that can be rolled in a pool is your character's grade. You can think of this as being like a level in other systems. Again, there's not a lot of information on grades in the rules reference document. In fact, most of what is mentioning grades is right there on this page in like 1 or 2 little spots. A character's grade reflects the amount of time that character has spent in doing other things and developing their skills before they joined us in this story. These usually take the forms of career slots during the life path character creation system, which we'll have to jump into in another video. Therefore, a youthful character, fresh off the farm, so to speak, would only have their origin career, like let's say Acolyte or Navy Brat. They would therefore be at grade 1 and will be limited to a rolling pool, as you can, which is not on the chart here because that one starts at 5. They would be limited to a max rolling pool of 3 6-sided dice. A character of grade 1 should also only have about 28 attribute points, 5 skill points, and 3 exploits, which we'll describe in a moment. Your typical starting character in the WOIN game, however, is actually recommended to be grade 5, which is why the chart here on the page starts at grade 5. This character would have their origin career, and then also at least 4 levels in other careers, essentially. They would be rolling a max dice pool of 5d6. A character in this grade should have 44 attribute points, as we mentioned previously, 13 skill points, and 7 exploits. However, there is an optional rule to emphasize the equipment aspect of the game that would allow this grade dice cap to actually only apply to the attribute or skill dice added together, and the equipment dice would just be extra on top of this cap. This may actually be a good rule to use in something akin to a looter shooter or a sort of gear cultivation style of game, because it really puts extra, the equipment is really an upgrade to anybody who's using it. So even if you have like a super skilled character, you can always add more. The 2 final aspects of a WOIN character that I would like to describe here are exploits and the descriptor. When picking your character's career, heritage, or other aspects, you can pick a series of exploits. In many ways, the exploits, the universal ones of which can be seen here, in many ways, these are like feats or other similar mechanics like feats in other games. The ones that allow you to bend or break the rules in minor ways from time to time. For example, you might be able to roll an extra dice in certain situations, do a special action, use different attributes than you would normally be allowed to do, ignore certain conditions, and so on. The descriptor, meanwhile, is something that would be very familiar to anyone who's ever played the cipher system. This is typically phrased as a sentence that describes your character, that's made up of your character's name, their trait, heritage, their most recent or significant career, and a hook. It may also include their age if the character is considered rather young or old for their heritage. Here's an example. Let's say for a modern version of a character, let's say from the N.O.W book, your character descriptor might be Dr. Henry Jones is an old, erudite human archaeologist who seeks truth in myth and legend. We have not discussed what exactly the trait or hook is yet. We've mentioned pretty much the rest of that. So we'll elaborate on the trait and hook here. The trait is like an exploit that the character gets based on their highest or lowest attribute. Using the earlier example we mentioned in our sentence of erudite, a character with this trait has a very high logic score and can use logic instead of charisma, and in one social interaction per target. So in other words, whenever I'm interacting with an NPC, I can use logic instead of charisma as the skill that I'm rolling whenever I'm doing a social interaction with that character, but then I can't do it again with that character. Instead, I can use it with a different character. The idea of this is that the character is relying on their wealth of knowledge in order to impress instead of their charming personality. But of course, at a certain point, even a super smart character with a very wide-ranging knowledge that might be relevant for the situation at hand will run out of things to say and will end up looking boorish if they have a low charisma. The hook at the end of the sentence, meanwhile, is typically a broad interest, background, or hobby that the player decides to create for their character in order to help build out their character's personality and motivations beyond all of the other mechanics we discussed previously. When at any time when your character would make an attribute check where the descriptor would apply, they can use that descriptor to make their dice pool explode. Obviously, dice aren't going to actually blow up on the table. This means instead that any sixes that are rolled add an additional die to the pool that you can roll and then add in. So again, returning to our example of Dr. Jones, let's say he's making a logic check using the research skill to try to find a possible location of a real Holy Grail. His player might roll a pool of 66. And let's say he gets a 1, 2 2s, a 5, and 2 6s. Since this has to do with finding elements of truth in myth and legend, because he's looking for a mythical thing that he feels should be real, right? Then Dr. Jones's player would get to roll and add 2 more d6s, let's say a 3 and a 4, and add that 7 to the 22 that he already rolled, so his total is actually 29. I know for many people, combat is a significant portion of your TTRPG play. In WOIN, combat is pretty tactical, like many other tabletop sort of role-playing games based on war games, like D&D and other similar RPGs were derived from. WOIN games typically have a form of grid play and action economy. I'm not going to go into detail here. Go through turns and initiative and ambushes and sequences and so on and so forth. Again, I'm not going to elaborate on it here. It is going to be incredibly familiar to pretty much anybody who's ever played D&D, Pathfinder, or other games like that do have a very strict sort of turn-based action economy play. Attack rolls in combat for WOIN work similar to the other rolls we discussed earlier. However, one addition happens whenever you roll 3 or more 6s in a dice pool. This counts as an automatic success, even if you don't actually hit the target number. However, should the resulting total be above the difficulty target number, it inflicts a critical hit. Critical hits impose a special condition on the defending character. The specifics of that condition depends on the type of weapon or damage that's being inflicted. For example, if I score a critical hit with a slashing weapon, like a sword or some sort of like pole arm that has like an axe on the end or something, then there is a chance that I may cause my target to gain a bleeding, blinded, or slowed condition. When defending, your character will not roll, but instead have several static defense stats called melee defense, range defense, mental defense, and vital defense. These are derived stats. They are created by adding together a relevant ability, skill, and equipment, then multiplying the number of dice that you would normally roll in that pool by 3.5 in order to generate an average number. These are what they refer to as derived stats, in addition to your health and some other things. For example, the defense score for a dice pool of 46 would be 14. Any score under 10 is automatically upgraded to 10. Because 10 is sort of like the absolute lowest roll, difficulty roll. Unlike in D&D, though, one element that's a bit different, each type of armor has a soak rating that takes the edge off of any damage applied to your character, in addition to potentially having some sort of other bonuses or dice that you might roll. I know that we're only just now scratching the surface when it comes to WOIN's mechanics. However, we are going to have to stop there for today. If you are still interested in WOIN's Rules Reference Guide, then you can definitely find the website where it is hosted in the link down below, along with the web page for example equipment, and again, any other relevant materials that I feel might be useful for anyone who might be interested in using WOIN. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more about TTRPG, SRDs, or systems in the future. Rate your itch purchases, and have a good zone. If you would like to show your support for this channel or for the Hessens County blog, in the description down below, you will find links to the channel Coffee and also the Itch Store. Please feel free to take a look, and thank you for your support.